Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Religious Roots of the American Abolition Movement, an online professional development seminar sponsored by the Florida Virtual School and the National Humanities Center. I'm Richard Schramm, the Vice President for Education Programs here at the Humanities Center, and I'll be moderating the session this morning. Before we get underway, I'd like to remind you of some of the resources that the Humanities Center offers for teachers. Those of you who have been with us before are familiar with these. But in case we have any new people, let me tell you about our online seminars. These are seminars just like the ones you're participating in now, only they're open to teachers all over the country. You see our fall schedule up there for 2010. We'll begin with the iconography of slavery on October 14th. Then we'll ask if the American Revolution was avoidable. We'll go on to learn how to read a slave narrative. We'll look at Southern women in the Civil War. And then in conjunction with the PBS series American Experience, we'll sponsor a seminar called Buffalo Bill, American Idol. And finally, on November 11th, we'll end our fall seminar schedule with Meaning in Marble, Civil War Monuments, and American Identity. Space is still available in these seminars. You can register for them now if you're interested in doing so. I encourage you to please do. In addition, we offer our Toolbox Library. These are primary resources, historical documents, literary text, images, and audio material, organized thematically within chronological frames, and they're illuminated by extensive notes and interpretive questions, and they are very usable in the classroom. If you go to our toolboxes, you'll find some text that you're familiar with, but then you'll also, I think, find some other material that will be rich and challenging and interesting for your students, and we try to make them as classroom friendly as we possibly can. In addition, we offer material more exclusively designed for teachers in TeacherServe. These are three we call instructional guides: Defining America, Religion in American History, Nature Transformed, The Environment in American History, and Freedom Story, Teaching African American Literature and History. And if you go to those, you will find essays written by leading scholars that help you teach the topics you see here. And related to our seminar topic this morning, if you look in the 19th century section of Defining America, you will see an essay on American abolitionism and religion, which we assigned for this program. You will also see some related essays: the Civil War, Southern Perspective, Religion in the Civil War, the Northern Side, and also evangelicalism as a social movement. I want to remind you, too, that when this session is over, you will be able to access the texts as you did in preparation for the session on the session's website. You will also find the recording of this seminar and the PowerPoint presentation on the site as well. So all of the material that you see today will be archived for you so that you can retrieve it at your leisure if you should decide to review it. And before we get underway, let me just remind you that you'll receive an evaluation form from us. It's probably in your mailbox right now. It'll say something like Abolition Movement Seminar. Please check both your inbox and your junk mailbox, because sometimes these things get shunted off to junk mail. As I always stress in these seminars, the evaluations are extremely important to us, and they're also important to the Florida Virtual School in connection with your Teaching American History project. So please fill that out and send it back to us. And then also you will receive a letter for you to submit to your local certifying authority as documentation of participation, so that you'll be able to get whatever recertification credit this seminar entitles you to. Finally, just to review how to participate, you folks know how to do it. You can raise your hand and make a question and raise a question, and I will call upon you, pass the microphone to you, and you can hold forth. Or you can simply send your questions and comments in to us through chat. I will be following the chat as we go through the program and bringing in some more pertinent questions and comments as they appear in the chat box. If you find that the chat box is distracting as it scrolls, you can simply collapse the chat box by clicking on that arrow to the left of the word chat. It will collapse, and then if you want to send a message, you can hit that arrow again and it will immediately pop up, and you'll be able to participate in that way. Are there any questions before we get underway? If everybody's ready to go, send me a smiling face and we'll move right ahead. Okay, there I'm seeing some. Good, good. I think we have a quorum. I hope everybody's ready. Okay, so then let's move on to consider the religious roots of the American abolition movement. We have a few goals for the seminar, and I think it's always good to put them out there. We have 4 in this one. First of all, we want to better understand the role of religious beliefs and institutions in the battle to end slavery. We also hope to understand the different audiences for abolitionist arguments. As always, we want to offer primary documents from a variety of participants, and then we also want to encourage your use of these primary documents in your classes, so we're shooting to better understand how to use these documents with your students. We have 3 framing questions that will guide discussion this morning. Why did Protestant churches come to see slavery as an evil that needed to be eradicated in the late 18th and early 19th centuries? What religious arguments did abolitionists use to make their case? And how did abolitionists use religious strategies and sentiments to appeal to other Christians, black and white, northern and southern, male and female? To lead us through those questions this morning, we're pleased to have with us Laurie Maffly-Kipp, who was a fellow at the National Humanities Center in 1993 and 94. When Laurie is not being learned here at the National Humanities Center, she is holding forth at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill as an associate professor of religious studies and American studies. Her research and teaching focuses on African American religion, religion in the Pacific borderlands of the Americas, and issues of intercultural contact. In 1994, she published Religion and Society in Frontier, California, and most recently, just this year, she has published Setting Down the Sacred Past. Now let me find Laurie's name right there and pass the host duties to her. Okay, Laurie, the seminar is all yours. You can take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Let me start by saying that this is all new technology to me, so I'm bear with me as I get used to talking to all of you virtually. I hope you'll feel free to ask lots of questions as we go along. I've tried to make this as user-friendly as possible and give you lots of opportunities to ask questions and ask questions that'll help you in your teaching as you go along. So let's get started. It would help me, I think, to have you all begin by talking about some of your experiences teaching abolition. So I'm framing here a couple of questions for you. First, how do you teach abolition? And let me just read the questions, and then I can throw them out to you. What role does religion play in your discussions, if any? Because my suspicion is that sometimes it doesn't play much of a role, but you can tell me. What points do you emphasize, and what documents or images do you use to do that? So anyone that wants to chime in.
Okay. Let us know, how do you teach abolition right now? Okay. Some people talk about John Brown's raid. Jennifer Schroeder brings that up in the chat.
Yeah.
And then
Diary.
Jamie Berry used diaries. Okay, Second Great Awakening and the Quakers, Frederick Douglass.
Yep.
They seem to be hitting the high points here. If I could ask Jamie, what diaries do you use? And if you could tell us the names of the people. And while she's thinking of that, we have accidental abolitionists like the Navy out of Pensacola. That's a new one on me. Underground Railroad, tying together women's rights and abolition. Some very, very good points.
Yeah, these are all things that that we're going to talk about, or most of them are things we're going to talk about today.
Of New England evangelists preaching against slavery, the Drinking Gourd, and other such songs. Jack Cartwright, I don't use religion. I teach American government separation of church and state. Jamie's going to look up the names, but she uses the Diary of a Slave Owner. Okay. And
good.
David Walker
and
then Fanny Kemble. Good. Yeah. I think we've got some sophisticated approaches here.
We do.
There are a lot of traditionally black churches in my area. The kids can identify with that. Oh, very good. Very good.
Yeah. Good. Well, we're going to touch on a lot of these. I guess, I'm curious about the idea of not teaching this because of the separation of church and state. And believe me, because I teach in a public university, I understand that issue. What I find, though, is that it's really hard for students to understand why all of a sudden in the late 18th century, people started to see slavery as a bad thing unless you talk about religion or unless you bring up the kinds of assumptions people have about human beings, what human beings are, how they ought to be treated. You can talk about it in terms of the revolution and sort of the idea of equality, but even the idea of equality is kind of hollow unless you really dig back into issues about religious groups and how they're where these understandings come from. I think one of the most important things for me to stress to students is that up until the mid-18th century, 1700s, no one thought slavery was anything worth protesting. For hundreds of years, Christians had, gone about their business enslaving people, being enslaved, without thinking that slavery was a religious issue. So what happens in that moment of time? Now, some of you have already identified some of the things that happen, but it's just important to start by saying, students have to come to see that this is a new thing. For our students today, they of course, see, well, slavery is a bad thing. We understand that, but to sort of put them in a mindset before slavery was a bad thing is, in some ways, a harder thing. So, to raise the question with them, or to raise the issue that this is a big shift, that Christians are coming to see slavery as something that, and Americans are coming to see slavery because most Americans at this point, at least the ones that had a voice, are Christians. They're coming to see slavery as something that needs to be abolished. Now, one thing I like to do with them at this point is to go to the question of the Bible. What does the Bible say about slavery? Now, I have lots of students here who are pretty biblically literate, so it helps me to sort of point out to them what would people, if they were just picking up the Bible, think about slavery. So this is a good exercise, I think, to use with kids, at least my college-age kids. So what does the Bible say about slavery? Well, a couple of things. If I can, Richard, I'm not.
Did you click on it again?
I think I clicked on it again.
Try again.
Yeah.
Okay, let me see if I can. Laurie has used some sophisticated things here. Let me take back the host duties. See if I can move that ahead. Okay. There we go.
You got
Everybody see that?
Okay.
Okay, why don't I click through this one, Laurie, and I'll give it back to you.
Excellent. Yeah. Richard, do you want to read this too?
Okay, both thy bondman and thy bondsmaid, which thou shalt have, shall be of the heathen that are round about you. Of them shall ye buy bondsmen and bondsmaids. Moreover, of the children of the strangers that do sojourn among you, of them shall ye buy, and of their families that are with you, which they begat in your land, and they shall be your possession. And ye shall take them as an inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them for a possession. They shall be your bondsmen forever. But over your brethren, the children of Israel, ye shall not rule one over another with rigor.
Okay, can we stop there just for...
Okay, let me just get those all up. All right.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah, let's stop with that first quotation, because it tells us a couple of interesting things. And this is from the Hebrew Scriptures, from the Old Testament. It points out that there is a long tradition that Christians have been involved with in taking captives in wars. So the first phrase is about the heathen around you and strangers becomes a justification for enslaving people that you capture in wartime. And this is something that the Spanish, the British, were sort of fully bought into for many centuries. The last highlighted phrase, that was an interesting, sorry, not the last one, the question of the strangers and who the strangers and the heathen are is an interesting one, because it seemed to indicate, and this is the way that Christians talked about this issue for a while, is that it's a matter of deciding who is one of your own, right? Because in the last phrase it says, over your brethren, the children of Israel, ye shall not rule one over another with rigor. So there's a distinction made between those people it's okay to enslave and those people it's not okay to enslave. Now notice there's nothing here obviously about race or about it having anything to do with your skin color. It's about who is part of you, who is part of your community, and who isn't. So I like showing students these passages and getting them to reason out, well, how might you think about slavery? I mean, it's right there in the Old Testament. There doesn't seem to be any problem with it. It's just a question of sort of making laws to govern slavery. So one of the first issues is, well, who are our own? Who are the children of Israel? Also note that there is permission here to inherit them for possession. In other words, to enslave people for life. The Bible sanctions the idea that you can hold people for a lifetime. And so just to say, I mean, as some of you are already pointing out, yeah, there's slavery, certainly in the Old Testament. Well, what about the New Testament? Some of my students will say, well, the New Testament talks a lot about equality and freedom, and they think that maybe you can look there and find sanctions for freeing slaves. Well, yeah, sort of, but you also, as again some of you have pointed out, you see lots of things in the New Testament too that talk about slavery as though it were just an acceptable institution. And in fact, it talks about, it gives advice to slaves, okay? And this was advice that, as some of you probably know, preachers in the southern states in the antebellum period preached to their slaves on a regular basis. They used these passages as a way to say, obey your earthly masters. This is what it means to be a good Christian. You obey them, you sort of put up with your station in life and go about your business as best you can. Second passage from 1 Timothy, let slaves regard their masters as worthy of all honor. Again, these don't suggest that slavery is a bad thing or give us any grounds in the Bible for advocating for getting rid of slavery. So the New Testament, in a sense, you could argue, and lots of people did, had no trouble with slavery either. Now, so then the question is, okay, where does this come from? And as Darlene just pointed out, it's not based on race. Absolutely, there's nothing in the Bible here about race at all. That comes much later. So how do Christians get this new way of thinking? They don't get it. If they don't get it from the Bible, where else are they going to get it from? What I then suggest to students is that there are three different kinds of places that one can look for sort of hints that there are religious groups and religious movements that are starting to think about slavery in new ways. A couple of you have already mentioned the first one, and this is chronologically the first one as well as the first one I talk about, and that's the Quakers. The Quakers are an interesting group. They are sort of this is something I have humorous ways to point out to my students. The Quakers are kind of odd and quirky people in the 16th and 17th centuries in the British colonies. We think of Quakers now, we think of the Quaker Oats man, or we think of sort of pacifists who don't who aren't very radical. Well, the Quakers of the 16th and 17th centuries were very radical, some of them, and were quite willing to speak up for things that they believed in. I always describe to my students the Quakers who, in Puritan New England, ran down the middle aisle of the church naked to protest the power held by the Puritans. And Quakers were hanged in Puritan New England for their subversive views. So the Quakers, had a different reputation at this point. The Quakers, though, are interesting here because they introduced this idea that every human being, contained within every human being and every human soul, is a spark of the divine, some tiny piece of God. And it's that piece that we need to nurture. Our Christian ethic is to educate, to nurture, to bring out the divinity in all people. Very different from what other Protestants at the time believed, that they believed that human beings, because of original sin, were all complete sinners, and that only through God's grace could they be saved. Could some spark of goodness be put in them rather than pulled out of them. The Quakers really saw it the other way around. You can pull the good out of people. And this allows for them to say, all people, in some sense, then, are equal because they all have a piece of God within them. So there's contained within that idea, I think, is a radically new way of understanding human potential. And that's what the Quakers begin to see. They also slavery becomes a particular target for them because slavery makes it impossible, they believe, to really educate and nurture that divinity within the slaves. They also point out that it hurts slave owners because it warps them. It makes them sort of not the Christians they ought to become. So they're just as worried, in fact, about the slave owners as they are about the slaves themselves. What this means in practice is that Quakers who, as you all know, are in Pennsylvania, predominantly in Pennsylvania, centered around Philadelphia in the 18th century, by the 1750s and 1760s, they start to found schools for black children as a way of, again, educating them and bringing out that potential that they feel they all have. Most Quakers at this point are what would be called gradualists. They aren't, Quakers in Philadelphia by the 18th century are pretty, they're middle class, they're pretty stable, they're not rocking the boat quite the way those earlier, more radical Quakers were. So they don't want to overthrow the slave system, but they are trying to sort of push against it in various ways. But there are a few Quakers who sort of fit back into that older model better. And these are great subjects for students because there are some interesting characters. Probably the most interesting is a guy called Benjamin Lay. Benjamin Lay is a migrant to Philadelphia. Actually, he starts in Barbados and gets drummed out of there because he's a little too radical and anti-slavery for most of the Barbadian plantation owners. He is an ardent abolitionist, one of the first really vocal people to say slavery is a sinful thing. We need to get rid of it immediately. He's a very interesting man. He, as you can tell from this picture, I love showing my students this picture. He's only about 4 feet tall. He's kind of a hunchback, a little odd-looking little guy. Lives by himself in a cottage. Is a vegetarian, because he doesn't want to harm animals in any way, so he won't eat anything that might cause an animal to be sacrificed. Drinks only milk and water. Won't wear anything made of animal products, so he makes all his own clothes and avoids everything that is produced by slave labor. So he's a purist in a sense, but he will not let go of the slave issue, and he spends all his time hammering home to other Quakers. He puts out all these pamphlets to other Quakers in Philadelphia saying slavery is a bad thing. He also protests other things, the prison system, capital punishment, the problems of rich Quakers themselves. So he's not a very well-liked man, but he pushes Quakers, and I think he's important to see as sort of he's considered sort of the John the Baptist of the Quaker movement. He pushes them to become more principled and to remove slave owners from their communities. So he inspires a whole new generation of activists. He himself dies in 1760, but it's really in the next generation that Quakers look back on him and really start to revere him as sort of a great apostle of the future. I know a lot of you are saying he would still be an eccentric. Yes, he was quite eccentric, but sometimes eccentricities are so the best way to make your point or the best way to get attention. So he was sort of out of the mainstream, but really setting the stage for, by the 19th century, a different understanding that the Quakers come to have about slavery. Now, I will also say here that Quakers, it's important to see that Quakers are anti-slavery. They are not, however, big advocates of completely equal rights. There's a big difference. There's a huge gap, in fact, at this point in time between advocating equal rights, integration in American society, and advocating anti-slavery. So like other white anti-slavery activists, most white Quakers still have segregated seating in their churches. They still don't think necessarily that blacks and whites ought to be assimilating, but they don't think slavery is a good institution. So, you know, I tried just to point out to students that this isn't equality the way we might think about equality. This isn't post-civil rights equality. This is still 18th and 19th century equality. I don't know if I should stop. Richard, should I stop for questions? Or
well, we can stop. Sure. Are there any questions or comments so far? Earlier, here we go from Jack Carter. Yes. What you argue for is not the same thing as you will let them into your drawing room, right?
Right.
Earlier on, Peter Billingsley asked a question: is there, or he made a statement: is there any place in the Bible that condemns slavery?
There are references in the Old Testament to the year of Jubilee that was observed by the Jews, where every seventh year they would free slaves and forgive loans. So there are certainly lots of references in the New Testament to the equality of all souls. Mm-hmm. There's no place, though, where it says you shouldn't hold slaves. It's a bad thing. And in most Christian churches, in this point in time, they're willing to interpret the equality of all souls to say, well, yes, spiritually we're all free, and that's why we're going to bring you to church. That's why we're going to bring the slaves to church, so that they can become Christians and achieve salvation, and they will receive their due reward in the afterlife. So it's not necessarily, it doesn't, I mean, it's sort of a tension throughout the history of sort of missions to the slaves. Well, does baptizing a slave or does allowing a slave into a church mean that you have to free them? And almost immediately the answer from white ministers is no, you don't necessarily have to free slaves. It's still possible because we all have our earthly stations. We all have our jobs in life. There are hierarchies in the world. Christianity does not do away with all hierarchy. So it's a way of sort of keeping the institution of slavery preserved, but kind of acknowledging that, well, someday there will be equality of all souls.
Okay, good point. Well, Laurie, we have about an hour left. Why don't we move on to see what else changed? Christian minds.
So Quakers. This piece is, I think, really crucial. And a couple of you, I think someone earlier on mentioned that they were in an area with lots of black churches. This is also the period of time, late 18th century, early 19th century, when African Americans who are being freed in northern states because of manumission laws, beginning around the time of the Revolution, begin to form their own Christian churches, breaking away from white churches, forming like the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was formed in Philadelphia in the early 19th century, African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in 1821, formed in New York City. So there are a variety of independent black Presbyterian and Baptist churches that are organizing in urban areas in the North, where they are allowed by law to organize freely away from whites. And it's in this kind of organizing process that also includes other kinds of community organizations, Masonic lodges, Sunday schools for black students, that you really get sort of a critical mass of free blacks who are gaining an education, now have access to some kind of education. They're still kept out of the public school systems, but they form their own schools and start to learn to read and to use sort of the power of their education. They get a hold of printing presses and start to print religious publications in the 1820s. It's then that you see sort of blacks start to have some kind of public voice in the U.S., and they start immediately to advocate for the abolition of slavery. Obviously, many of them are, freed slaves themselves, or maybe a generation removed from it by this time. But almost all of them see the cause of the slaves in the South as their own cause. It's also interesting, I think, that just the fact that there are free blacks who become educated and who become eloquent spokespeople against slavery serves as a proof to whites that it's possible, because many whites at this point are saying, well, in fact, African Americans are genetically incapable. This is sort of where the racism comes in. They're genetically incapable of becoming full citizens. And when you have these, again, very eloquent, very educated blacks standing up and giving speeches and proving, just by virtue of their existence, that that's not true, it's a refutation. It becomes a refutation in and of itself of the justification for slavery, or one justification for slavery, which is that, well, we have to enslave these people because they can't be full citizens like the rest of us. So, you know, as we read the texts of this movement, to see the texts themselves really as proof, African Americans understood these as proof that slavery was in fact an evil system.
Darlene Birch has gone back to our point about anti-slavery statements in the Bible, and she has found Exodus 21:16. Anyone who kidnaps another and either sells him or still has him when he is caught must be put to death. But that's kidnapping. That's maybe you may be kidnapping somebody who is one of your own tribe, and that would not be acceptable.
Exactly, and that's where you get into the distinction between those heathens and strangers and other Israelites, who, of course, it's not okay to kidnap the Israelites. As long as as long as you're dealing with heathens and strangers, you're on safe territory in the Hebrew Scriptures. So, and there are, I will say, I mean, if you go back to the Bible, there are lots of places in the Hebrew Scriptures where there are rules about how to treat slaves. You can't do anything you want, for the most part, to slaves. And in fact, some abolitionists later begin to argue that, well, the Hebrew Bible slavery is much more humane than the American system of slavery. They contrast the Bible of the Old Testament to what Americans have come up with and say, look, the Americans aren't even, humane about this. If you look at Leviticus, at least there are some rules that govern what slave owners can do. But in the United States, slave owners can basically torture or kill their slaves if they want to. So that's not even, that's how they get around the issue of the fact that there is slavery in the Old Testament.
So that in the Old Testament, slavery was hedged around with all sorts of religious conditions, all sorts of spiritual laws.
Exactly. Okay. Okay, so the case, a couple of you mentioned, someone mentioned using Walker, David Walker, and he's the person, my go-to person for dealing with sort of someone who is a free black man who himself sort of had lived, he was born free, but he had lived in a slave situation and moves north to Boston in the 1820s. And begins almost immediately to advocate against slavery, and becomes probably the most, in the antebellum era, the most well-known free black abolitionist for his work. His career, unfortunately, was quite short. He also was very involved in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and he often doesn't get talked about as a religious figure, but throughout his appeal, it's all directed toward religious argument for why slavery is a bad thing. So to leave out the religion here, again, I think doesn't do justice to sort of what he's arguing about. He, as I said, he settles in Boston, opens a clothing store in the 1820s, and immediately starts writing for the very first African American periodical published in the United States, Freedom's Journal, which was an abolitionist newspaper that began publication in 1827. In 1829, Walker publishes his major work, Walker's Appeal. It's a lengthy pamphlet. He reprints it and revises it several times in 1829 and 1830. 2 months after he puts out revisions, a revised edition in 1830, which is the picture you see here, he was found dead in his home, very young age, as someone points out. So there's always been suspicion. Nothing was ever proved about who killed him or how he died. Some people said it was tuberculosis. Other people said he was murdered by people who were worried about his incendiary politics. We don't know for sure. He did have a lot of enemies, though. That's for sure. His appeal is a great teaching tool. And does anyone? Someone mentioned using it. Does anyone else? Did anyone else say that they had used parts of this?
If you use David Walker's appeal, why don't you put a green check next to your name? We'll use some of the technology here. Anybody use David Walker's appeal? Someone said earlier.
Yeah, someone mentioned it.
Let's see. There we go. Samantha Bowman uses David Walker. Anyone else? So David Walker is going to be new to, or at least new as a classroom resource to a lot of our participants. Good.
Yeah, there's such a great story around him. He apparently he addresses this to, as it says in the on the title page, to the colored citizens of the world. So he's really thinking broadly and thinking universally. It's not just in the U.S. This is to all people of color around the world. But he addresses most specifically, and this is probably the biggest rub, he addresses slaves in the South and basically says, you have the right to get up and revolt against your masters. And so he's trying to incite a slave revolt, which of course leads white Southerners to completely sort of be up in arms about this. His works are banned in southern states. He himself uses really interesting techniques to get this document into the South. Because he worked in the clothing business, and he had a store near the port in Boston, he apparently sewed copies of the pamphlet into the linings of coats and other garments worn by sailors who would then go to the South. So this got smuggled into southern states in the linings of people's clothing. And so we do have evidence that it circulated in the South as much as white Southerners tried to sort of squelch it. And in fact, I think a $3,000 price was offered on his head by white Southerners at one point too. So you can see when he died, not long after that, there was a lot of suspicion about how that happened. One scholar has talked about this work and said that for a brief and terrifying moment, it was the most notorious document in America. So what exactly does the document say? Well, you have sort of more of it to read, and it's online, it's easily accessible. But I just thought I'd give you a few examples of the way he talks. He's so much more direct and forceful about how awful slavery is than anyone else had dared to be before him. Even free blacks in the North, who ostensibly they were free, they were clearly second-class citizens still, and many of them in their public rhetoric were still quite polite when it came to talking about politics. They would protest slavery, but they did it in a fairly mild way compared to David Walker, who really sort of came out and told it like it was. Richard, do you want to read this for us?
The fact is, the labor of slaves comes so cheap to the avaricious usurpers, and is, as they think, of such great utility to the country where it exists, that those who are actuated by sordid avarice only overlook the evils, which will, as sure as the Lord lives, follow after the good. In fact, they are so happy to keep in ignorance and degradation, and to receive the homage and the labor of the slaves, they forget that God rules in the armies of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, having his ears continually open to the cries, tears, and groans of his oppressed people, and being a just and holy being, will at one day appear fully in behalf of the oppressed, and arrest the progress of the avaricious oppressors. For although the destruction of the oppressors God may not affect by the oppressed, may not be affected perhaps by the oppressed, yet the Lord our God will bring other destructions upon them. For not unfrequently will he cause them to rise up one against another, to be split and divided, and to oppress each other, and sometimes to open hostilities with sword in hand.
So this is again, I find this kind of passage a great thing to throw out to students to say, what's he saying here? What's he arguing for? Jack says he predicts a civil war, or some other kind of rebellion, right? Or some earlier revolution. What else do people see here?
In this you can hear some. Well, if you think of Lincoln's was the second inaugural. I mean, the just God is going to take a drop of blood for every a drop of blood won by the sword for every drop of blood shed by the lash.
Exactly. He's not. I mean, notice it's really clever. He's using the Bible. Even though the Bible doesn't condemn slavery, he's using the Bible to condemn slavery because he's talking about how God is a God of justice. He's interpreting the Bible to condemn slavery, or at least to condemn American slavery, by saying, our God is a just God, and even more, I think, more subversive, some causes justify holy violence. Some causes justify Christians getting up and fighting. And this is why so many of you are seeing the militancy here, the sense that this might be a foreshadowing of the war. It's certainly a foreshadowing of something. I mean, he doesn't know that there's going to be actually a war between the states at this point, but he's certainly advocating the idea that people who are being oppressed have the right, and have a sacred right, to stand up for themselves. Right? That's a very, very strong message to send to Christians. So it's clever because he doesn't have to address the fact that the Bible sanctions slavery. He's arguing that it's the kind of slavery that's important, right? It's these awful owners who are so bad that they deserve to have God and God's agents sort of smite them.
Shauna Lavrati brought up a good question that you might want to keep in mind as we go forward. Why is it that Uncle Tom's Cabin receives so much attention and Walker's to such a lesser degree? I think that's a good question that we can take up when you get later on to women abolitionists and the family. I don't have in mind to talk too much about Harriet Beecher Stowe, but it is a really great question that we can all talk about too. But I think this is, as much as Stowe is anti-slavery, she is not a black herself and doesn't directly come out to say that blacks have the right, a God-given right, to stand up for themselves. And that's sort of a step beyond her. But that's a great point. Okay, this piece, I don't think we need to read the whole thing. In fact, it's lots of words that are hard to pronounce. So we don't. The reason that I put it up here for you, though, is that this is an example of what I talked about before. The idea that just the fact that you have a free black who uses history and uses all of these sort of example after example of God's justice throughout history is itself a sort of refutation of the grounds of enslavement. This man is a learned man. He's read a lot of books. He knows a lot about history. And the idea that somehow he is a lesser human being is, I think, one of the implicit arguments for him and for other free blacks is that it's simply not true. Look what I can do, and it's a pretty remarkable list. And you see this a lot in black abolitionist rhetoric. So their use of, they go over the top in showing how learned they are. And learned even though they aren't allowed officially to be in the public school system. They're kept out of schools. They're finding these books on their own. And this is sort of one of the things the book I just wrote talks a lot about this. Where are these folks getting all of the learning that they have? But it's a pretty remarkable kind of testimony to sort of the power of their arguments. And students like to see this because they don't know all this history these days either. So it's interesting for them to notice. Okay.
finally, on David Walker, Richard, would you mind just reading the first, let's just read the first paragraph of this.
How many million souls of the human family have the blacks beat nearly to death to keep them from learning to read the Word of God and from writing, and telling lies about them by holding them up to the world as a tribe of talking apes, void of intellect, incapable of learning, etc.?
So this makes the point, first of all, that I was talking about, that they're not void of intellect. He himself is proof of that. They're not incapable of learning. But it also points out, not only are sort of slave owners bad people, but they're bad Christians because they're stopping African Americans themselves from becoming good Christians. They're stopping them by passing, laws that keep African Americans from learning to read and write. They themselves are keeping them from salvation, and this is anti-Christian. So it's now we're getting into some of his religious arguments about sort of the evils of slavery. And when he says, just to clarify, in that first sentence, when he says have the blacks beat nearly to death, he's not talking, I think, there about African Americans. The way I read it, he's using black as a sort of derogatory term for slave owners. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense the way it's worded. So it's the slave owners that are beating them to death, keeping them from learning to read the Word of God. The second paragraph, just at the bottom, I would just highlight that last sentence. The American ministers send out missionaries. He's now taking up the issue of the fact that the missionary movement, the foreign missionary movement, is getting started around this time. So even as churches are sending out missionaries all over the world to convert the heathen, they are keeping people at home, African Americans in their own country, from learning about Christ. So that, again, this is part of that religious argument that they are keeping them from religion on purpose. And isn't that a terrible and sinful evil? Questions about this, about David Walker?
Any questions? I have a question. You mentioned that this was aimed at slaves. How much literacy could David Walker assume among his enslaved audience?
Well, slaves, as I said, were prevented from learning to read and write. Some of them did learn on their own to read and write. And later we're going to have the example of Frederick Douglass, who was taught by his slave mistress to read at an early age. But I think more importantly, these could be read aloud. And so if one person could read, they could read it to other folks. So people weren't necessarily reading these things, but they were hearing about them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin, of course, was read widely. I mean, it was a tremendous bestseller in the 19th century. How widely read was David Walker's appeal among white audiences, say, in the North? Did it overlap at all to much degree with Stowe's audience?
Well, it's earlier. This is 20 years earlier. So, and I think people certainly knew about it. Mm-hmm. It was because Stowe's, it comes along at a very different political moment. This is David Walker writes this at the very beginnings of the abolitionist movement, when it's just the point when people are starting to say, we can't just gradually end slavery. Even that Northerners have been saying that for 30 or 40 years, that gradually slavery will come to an end. Now people are really starting to stand up and say, this isn't going away. In fact, in the 1820s, it looks like it's starting to get worse in the South, not better. Yeah. The slave system is starting to get more restrictive, more violent, with new areas of cultivation opened up in the Deep South, places like Alabama and Mississippi, huge plantations. People are being sold downriver to these very large plantations, and the system looks like it's getting worse and worse. So it's really, he's sort of a trailblazer in a sense here. And of course, African Americans have been saying this stuff for a while. He just says it in probably the most eloquent and sort of lengthy kind of pamphlet. And but Stowe takes up some of these arguments later on. She couches them though in a story, you know, in a more sentimental, in a story that's a little more appealing to Northern whites who are not going to be quite ready for David Walker's honesty in the 1830s. So it's a question of the right thing for the right moment.
Right. I think that does address Shauna's question about why Harriet Beecher Stowe really gets more attention. And Peter Billingsley raises a question: when was abolitionist literature outlawed in the South? And was Walker's work part of the reason?
Yes. Walker's work was definitely part of the reason. And there wasn't much abolitionist literature in the South before this. There weren't. The Freedom's Journal begins in 1827. That has some anti-slavery articles and things. That wasn't circulated as much in the South. But David Walker, by addressing slaves directly, by sending these pamphlets down south himself and getting them smuggled into the South, really forces the issue in a way. And this is also, for those of you who sort of know more about the anti-slavery movement, 1831 is another hallmark year. Anyone know what happened in 1831? 1831 is Nat Turner's rebellion. Nat Turner starts as a slave in Virginia, starts a slave insurrection, ends up killing 70 or 80 white, women, babies, men. It's a horrific slave rebellion. He himself is later captured along with his compatriots, and they are all put to death. This sends shockwaves throughout the South. So the combination of Walker's appeal and Nat Turner's rebellion coming within just within a year of one another it was, as Jolinda said, it was the South's worst nightmare. And that's when the laws really start to become more and more restrictive about not teaching slaves to read. They varied from state to state, so it's still, there's not uniformity about it, but that's really the point at which the slave system becomes, slave owners are so scared that this is going to happen that they start to lock down any kind of abolitionist literature.
Okay, good. Well, we've got about 40 minutes, Laurie. Shall we move ahead?
Yes, let's go on. Okay, so to case number 3, we've talked about the Quakers. We talked about the importance of black churches and black organizing in general. I think that's important because abolitionists often get, I find when people talk about abolitionists, they assume we're talking about whites, but in fact, this is an interracial movement from the start. So that's the importance for me of bringing in the black church movement. It's not just that you have a Frederick Douglass or sort of a figurehead ex-slave brought in by white organizers. You have blacks themselves organizing and advocating on behalf of other African Americans at a really early point. But the third really important feature, as some of you, already mentioned, you talk about, is the Second Great Awakening and the revivals that begin among white evangelicals in about 1800. They really pick up steam, though, in the 1820s for reasons I'll explain in a minute. By evangelicals, I'm talking about sort of groups within the Baptist, mostly Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian folds. Not all of those churches could be really characterized as evangelical. In fact, in the 1840s, all 3 of these churches split along sort of political and theological lines over the issue, mostly over the issue of slavery. So that here's where you were beginning to see rifts in the movement, brought about in part by these revivals that are bringing all of these folks together, de-emphasizing the denominational differences and emphasizing the fact that this is we are having a dramatic experience of a rebirth, and that should lead on to social reform in our society. This is the movement that, for whites, especially in the North, moves slavery to a central place in American Protestant life, and from the 1820s on to the time of the war, it's revivalism that really keeps the abolition as a front burner topic. So a little bit about revivals and reforms. A lot of you probably know something about this, but this is the point at which, as I already said, there's a shift of consciousness from seeing slavery as a bad thing. I mean, from the 1780s, the Methodists almost outlawed slavery in the 1780s. they backed down from that because of their southern constituency, and they said, okay, well, let's just think about doing away with it gradually then. They just backed off from any kind of radical stand. But there was quite a bit of sentiment among northern evangelicals, Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, that slavery is something that is not a good thing. We're going to put up with it in the South because, remember, this is a time when the idea of a unified nation was novel, and that states had their own systems and rights. So most northern evangelicals were willing to say, okay, it's a bad system. We don't have to be involved in it. We're up in the North, and we can gradually try to do away with it. We see a shift from that idea to this sense that, in fact, there's something more corrosive. There's something about slavery itself that's going to affect all of us. And this is in part what Harriet Beecher Stowe herself is responding to in Uncle Tom's Cabin with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1851. I don't know if any of you teach about the Fugitive Slave Law. But the big difference, the reason that the Fugitive Slave Law becomes such an issue for Northerners is because it argues that not only do Northerners have to put up with slavery in the Southern states, but the law says that Northerners, if they find a slave that has run away, they are themselves legally obligated to return that slave to its owners. So it implicates Northerners, or it brings them into the slave system in a way that I think points out to them that they're connected to this. They can't get away from it, and that this is affecting the whole country. So this is around the 1820s and 1830s is when this really starts to hit in churches. And as I said, it's tied to this series of revivals where people are preaching about the need for social reform, about the need to purify our nation. This is still a very, very new country to these folks, and they see salvation, sort of Christian salvation, as the only way to make a godly nation. Yes, we've separated church and state. Most of them see that as a good thing. They want to have freedom to associate religiously with whoever they want. But they also think that if you don't have a state church, you really have to stress social reform as being part of a Christian's obligations in life. Northern evangelicals also increasingly associate slavery itself with sinfulness. It's not just that it's a bad thing. It's not just a bad custom, but it is something sinful, and it is something that impedes the ability of individuals to achieve salvation themselves if they are involved with it in any way. So that's the big shift that's going on here, and you see a lot of abolitionists talking about this malum in se, but that's just the Latin term. It's a bad thing in and of itself. It's not just bad because it leads to other bad things. It's a bad thing it's a sin in and of itself. These revivals are also popular and effective in large part because they are led by very charismatic leaders. Two of which I love to show the picture of Charles Grandison Finney. I have this big blow up of this picture that I show my students every semester because he's got these eyes. I don't know if you can see them very well in this slide, but those eyes just penetrate. They're deep set, penetrating eyes that on a big screen look really effective. He is the revivalist, and he is really the one who innovates in revivals and urges over and over again that if you are saved, if God has saved you, you now are obligated to go out and purify the world around you. You don't just sit back, you don't rest on your laurels. He is accompanied by a man named William Lloyd Garrison, who we'll talk about more in a minute, a very well-known abolitionist who's an organizer. His great strength is founding a newspaper, the Liberator newspaper, getting people involved in the movement. He's the one that brings in women to write in his paper. He teams up with Frederick Douglass. He turns the abolitionist movement in the 1830s into an interracial force to be reckoned with in large part. So it's sort of this double this double whammy of these two that really brings abolition to center stage for evangelicals by the 1830s. Questions about that? That's a lot of talking, I know.
Questions? I have a question. You mentioned that the revivals helped to blur denominational lines, and I think they also helped to undermine the power of whatever church hierarchies existed in these denominations. Did they also move people away from the literal interpretation of the Bible? Because how did the emotionalism of the revivals counteract the fact that Scripture did endorse slavery?
Well, evangelicals found other ways around that. I don't know if it moved them to be less literal. And no one was, I have to say, up until the late 19th century, there weren't any what we would now call fundamentalists who really said you have to interpret the Bible literally at every point. That's a much later development. Mm-hmm. At this point, though, people are willing to sort of trade biblical arguments. And in fact, as part of the abolitionist movement, one of the things that comes out of it is a series of debates over slavery among Christians. There's one in particular that goes on for like 8 hours. These two men debating and sort of throwing the Bible back and forth at one another. I would say, though, and this is why I brought up the Bible first off, that, and my students have said this to me, said the Bible really, if you look at it and you just look at the words in there, makes a much stronger argument for slavery than against slavery. So the evangelicals have to find other ways to use the Bible, and that's what is so interesting about some of these figures, is how are they then taking religious arguments, and even though the Bible says that slavery is okay, they use the Bible to argue against this particular slave system. So that's sort of the ingenious character of a lot of these folks we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. And that's a great segue, Richard, into sort of the next point, which is to talk about, we're moving away from sort of the origins of the movement to talk about how you bring the issue of slavery home to Americans. What do you do to make Americans, who are sort of sitting on the fence at this point or a little scared of those abolitionists, how do you get them to see that slavery is a bad thing? I think this is a great exercise to set up for students. How do you persuade people? What arguments would you use to persuade people? So let me just suggest a few of those arguments that the abolitionists did use. But I would encourage you, to have students, think about this and think about, well, what, knowing what you know, or give them some documents and say, how would you use this to argue against slavery? Or how are you, faced with this system and a Bible that seems to say slavery is okay? What are you going to say to get around it? So my first example is, as I put it, to send out cool-looking bad boys with fire in their eyes. And one of the things that Charles Finney in particular, is responsible for is bringing in young people into the revivalist movement, a new generation who are rebels and are seen as rebels. So you have, the archetype of this is a man named Theodore Dwight Weld. I love Theodore Dwight Weld. He's got that look. He has sort of a James Dean look. Of course, the students won't know who James Dean is either. But sort of a look of that rebel, that defiant look, even though he's wearing a bow tie at the same time. My students love this picture of him. He just looks like a college student who's not going to put up with anything. And he himself becomes sort of the figurehead for Charles Finney's what's called the Holy Band of Revivalists. These young men and some women, as we'll see, who go around preaching about salvation and temperance. He's also, the temperance is a big movement at this point, so it's not just anti-slavery, but also temperance. He himself helps to found the American Anti-Slavery Society in the 1830s with Garrison. He goes off to seminary to become a minister in 1834, but he gets in trouble because he's preaching abolition. And again, that shows you, even though Lane Seminary is in the north, in Ohio, it shows you how incendiary this issue is for Northerners. He gets dismissed from the seminary and later goes on with other like-minded abolitionists to found Oberlin College, which is the first not only abolitionist or openly abolitionist school, but it is the first interracial and co-ed school that champions equal rights in the U.S. So it has a very distinguished lineage. But that's seen as sort of the hotbed of this radicalism. He marries Angelina Grimke, who we'll hear about in just a minute, in 1838, and the two of them together really become sort of the young, fresh young face of the movement. And so if image is part of selling this idea, he is sort of one of the main figures. Oh, this is one of my slides, Richard, that I might need your help on.
Okay.
I'm clicking and it's not working.
All right. For some reason, I have seemed to have lost the host privileges. So, Laurie, if you would highlight my name.
Highlight your name.
Yes, just click it. Okay,
yep.
Then you should have a little yellow, a little blue and green ball down.
I do.
Just hit that.
Okay. Wait, it highlighted me.
Highlight my name and hit that little ball and give me the host privileges back. This is, I don't know what the problem is here. Okay, let me see if I can do it. We'll get that. We'll get that. Sorry about this, folks.
That's okay. I can read some of these great comments while you're doing that. Yeah, the Grimke sisters, someone says they didn't, Samantha says that she didn't know the Grimke sisters got married. Sarah didn't get married. Angelina's older sister, Sarah, was not married. But Angelina was most definitely married. But it's interesting that your students call them old maids. I don't know if that says more about sort of their reputation or what. I mean, if you look at, you'll see the picture of Angelina in a minute, and she sort of has an old maidish look about her, but most 19th century pictures look like old maids.
Okay. Laurie, do you see, do you have anything up on your screen now?
No.
Okay. I can't reclaim this is screwed up. I can't reclaim the host thing. If you could again highlight my name and down down just above the chat, there should be a little blue and green ball. If you could highlight my name and click that ball, then you should pass the host.
See, the blue and green ball is next to my name, and when I click it, it just highlights my name too.
Okay, highlight my name down below. I'll highlight my name.
I'm seeing your name twice, but okay.
Yeah. All right, highlight where it says host.
Okay, I highlighted that.
And then is the ball down below, just above the chat?
No, there's no ball down below.
All right, let's move on then. I would think what you need to do is just okay, good. All right, good. Somehow I got the host back. Okay, now let's see if it works. There we go. Do you see anything?
I'm seeing Theodore Dwight Weld.
All right, we're not seeing Weld wrote the Bible Against Slavery?
No, that would be the next slide, I think. But
all right.
You can get there.
Let's go back to Weld. Okay. Now, how about there?
I'm still on Theodore Dwight Weld.
Okay. Well, let me see if I can move on to number 29.
Okay, now it's blank again. And now it's back to Theodore Dwight Weld.
Okay, I don't know what the.
We can move to 20. Let me just describe what I was going to say about. I just had a couple quotations from Theodore Dwight Weld up on that slide. He wrote a book in 1837 called "The Bible Against Slavery," and it's really a great example of how you can use the Bible, even though the Bible talks about slavery as being okay, how you can still use the Bible to make your argument against slavery. And he does it by really, and this is something you can ask your students, well, what's he doing here? What are these, to take one sentence, what's he doing with this? So I can just read those, actually it's 2 sentences long. Let me read it and explain what I mean by this. Weld says, slavery seeks refuge in the Bible only in its last extremity. It seizes the horns of the altar in desperation, rushing from the terror of the avenger's arm. Like other unclean spirits, it, quote, hateth the light, neither cometh to the light, lest its deeds should be reproved. He's quoting there from John chapter 3, verse 20. So what he's saying here, he says, like other unclean spirits. He is saying slavery is an unclean spirit. Slavery is like the devil. And he is likening slavery to this evil. spirit. So even though slavery itself isn't described in the Bible, he can use then all kinds of biblical passages to talk about the evils of slavery. And that's what he does. He uses it, in a sense, metaphorically, if you will, to say, slavery is a bad thing, just like these unclean spirits that we see in the New Testament. And he does this over and over again, uses biblical passages as if they're talking about slavery, when in fact that's not really, that wasn't the original intention or meaning. But those are great, again, great pieces to use with students where they have to read a sentence and try to make some sense of what he's doing there. Okay, Richard, we can just go on to 29 if you can get us there.
All right, you don't see it up on your screen?
No, I'm still on 27 on my screen.
Okay, let me. I had some problems with the host business earlier. Okay, let's see now. What do you see now?
There it is. Now I'm seeing 28.
All right, let's go on to the 29. And I don't know why that's screwing up. Do you see how to bring the issues of slavery?
Yes, how to bring the issues. Okay, so this is point
Onward.
2. Right. Sorry about that. Once you get the bad boys in the picture, you saturate the media. And so this is a great way to bring artifacts and material culture and pictures into classes. Students always love pictures. To talk about the rise of publishing and the ways that cartoons and images drive home points about slavery. Now, do I have it back?
Yes, you should.
There
we go.
Okay, here we go. All right, so here is just an example. Unfortunately, you can't see these very well, although you can get these up online. If you just Google The Liberator, you can probably find these images right online. But you have, this is the masthead to that publication I mentioned, the first abolitionist newspaper founded by William Lloyd Garrison, where he uses all these pictures depicting touching scenes of families being separated, of slave auctions. This is what, if anything, prefigures Uncle Tom's Cabin and the kinds of things that Harriet Beecher Stowe writes about. It's these images, because it's appealing to people in precisely the same way. It's using sentiment, it's using emotions. It is Fox, Jack says, it is Fox News. It absolutely is Fox News for this generation. It's saying, it's sort of sensationalizing the image of enslavement. Underneath the words "the liberator," you can't read it, but I'll let you know that it says, "Our country is the world. Our country is all mankind." Now, if you recall what we said at the beginning about how the challenge, if you think about the Bible and trying to bring people into the community, that the idea in the Bible was that if they're in your community, you can't enslave them. Think about what that kind of universal message does. It says these people are part of who we are, too. And it's a sort of a subtle way of refuting the claim that they're different, they're foreign, they're heathen, they're outside the fold of the Israelites. So again, I always bring this back to that religious idea of what the community is all about. Oh, good. Someone already got the link. Oh, Richard, you already got the link up. Good. Okay.
That final one, the one on the bottom there, does echo David Walker about the just God coming in, freeing the slave and smiting the slaveholder.
It absolutely does. Yeah. Yeah. Same image. Okay. There's also great. There are great resources in writings for children, aimed at children in this period, mid-1830s. You probably can't read the text very well over on the left-hand side, but it is very explicit about saying, these abolitionists are going to try to get every little boy and girl to take hold of the great work of pulling slavery up by the roots. Message of appealing to the youth to abolish slavery. And again, you see a touching scene on the right-hand side of this emancipated family and how much happier they are. So the appeal to emotion here, like Stowe's book later on, is really an important piece of bringing home sort of the emotional content of enslavement. Okay, so you use lots of media, you have the cool boys, and then you appeal directly to different kinds of constituents. One of those, and one of the most important, is the appeal to women, not just to Southern Christian women, but to all women. And specifically, we're going to look here at the example of Angelina Grimke, who does appeal to Southern Christian women. She has a great essay where she speaks directly to the Christian women of the South for her appeal. But this, again, she's a compatriot of Garrison. Garrison brings her in to write for the Liberator. She then marries Theodore Dwight Weld, becomes very caught up in this movement. She is especially concerned because she thinks that slavery has a much more profound effect on slave women and actually and slave-owning women than on men, and tries to make an appeal specifically on the basis of gender. She's born in South Carolina, but leaves, her family is a prominent family of slave owners. She leaves there, follows her older sister Sarah, who's already left for Philadelphia, up to Philadelphia, where she joins up with the Quakers and very quickly gets involved in the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society there. And as I said, joins up with Garrison. Here are just a couple of passages that I picked out of her appeal to the Christian women of the South, an 1830s publication. What I love about this, the highlighted part of this particular passage, is how directly she is saying, I know you, I am like you, not only because I'm a Southern woman, I grew up in the slave system, but because of that Christian connection. We are sisters in Christ, and therefore I feel an interest in you. So she's using sort of every tool that she can muster to sort of claim common ground with these women, and to say, I understand you, I know what this is like, and here, let me tell you what the problem is, and what the danger is for your own soul in your connections with slavery. So it's between, sort of this appeal to being between women. She, Angelina Grimke, she got involved with Garrison after she saw a group of anti-slavery women in Boston who were mobbed, and felt that in that situation only women, as I said, could exert the influence to stop the slave system. Another, I think, helpful passage, and I'm going, Richard, I'm sort of moving quickly through this. I hope that's all right in the interest of time.
That's fine.
I'm trying to be cognizant of the time, but you all have these to go back to, so you'll be able to look at these some more. Here's another great argument she uses. She says, okay, now we're all on common ground. I'm like you, I'm Christian, I'm Southern. Here's what you can say. I know you're not in charge. I know it's really your husband who's in charge of the household. But here's what you do. You go, get ready. You can sort of force your husband in other ways. Use your persuasive powers as a wife, as a sister, a daughter, a wife, a mother, to do everything you can. So she's playing on those relationships again, and so pushing the idea that you have power, that you may not recognize in this situation. And if you really suppose you can do nothing to overthrow slavery, she says, you are greatly mistaken.
Yeah. Well, this again foreshadows Stowe. I mean,
yes,
Stowe
absolutely.
talked to women in the same way. She illustrated that in Uncle Tom's Cabin. We have two good points here in the chat. Yeah. Jack Carter asked, were there Southern writers showing the benefits of slavery? And Joylinda asked how effective Grimke was in the South.
Yeah. Great questions. To Jack's question, yes, there were Southern writers talking about the benefits of slavery. They believed, again, they were premising their arguments mostly on the idea that slaves were like children. They were never going to be the equals of whites. So it was a racist argument at this point. It was about the inferiority of their race. And they needed to be cared for. And who better to care for them than paternal Southern whites who wanted to take care of them because they were part of their families. And so Southern male writers would talk about sort of the importance of this family system. They also made the argument that the system in the North was far worse for workers than the slave system. They looked at the new factories that were coming as part of the Industrial Revolution in the northern states, and they said, look what you're doing to those factory workers. You're exploiting them. You don't take care of them. You don't treat them like part of your family. You don't even feed them. You give them very little money and then expect them to go make their own way in the world. At least with the slave system, we are taking care of these Southern blacks. So yeah, there was a lot of that Southern paternalistic argument about taking care of blacks because they couldn't, and the assumption was they couldn't take care of themselves. Jolinda's point about how effective she was very effective. Perhaps not so much among Christian women in the South, but certainly among Christian women in the North and among others in the North. She was a public speaker. She toured all around and gave speeches about this. The South, it's really hard to gauge how much of this really had an effect in the Southern states, but it's doubtful that it did. I think she was still seen as sort of a rebel rouser and a radical because she was a woman at a time when women didn't do much public speaking, who got up and spoke on her own. So that in and of itself was a sort of not a very Southern polite thing to do. But she did have a great effect in the North, and so she perhaps didn't reach the audience she wanted to.
Right. We have a question from Greg House. Did evangelicals oppose the, exegesis techniques used by the abolitionists?
Well, evangelicals were they were abolitionists. So, but yes, there were other evangelicals who pro-slavery evangelicals who said basically, you're wrong. The Bible says otherwise. There are these debates I talked about, these 8-hour debates that would go on. And there were Southern evangelicals who said, no, the Bible specifically says that slavery is all right. We're humane about it. We're taking care of our slaves. But you can't tell me that that's in the Bible. So they refuted it point for point. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, we've got about 10 minutes to go.
Okay. All right. So let's go on here. Okay. I think this is the last bit of Angelina Grimke. Let's see. Richard, do you want to read this for us?
Sure. I know that this doctrine of obeying God rather than man will be considered as dangerous and heretical by many, but I am not afraid openly to avow it because it is the doctrine of the Bible. But I would not be understood to advocate resistance to any law, however oppressive, if, in obeying it, I was not obliged to commit sin. If, for instance, there was a law which imposed imprisonment or a fine upon me if I manumitted a slave, I would on no account resist that law. I would set the slave free and then go to prison or pay the fine. If a law commands me to sin, I will break it. If it calls me to suffer, I will let it take its course unresistingly. The doctrine of blind obedience and unqualified submission to any human power, whether civil or ecclesiastical, is the doctrine of despotism and ought to have no place among Republicans and Christians.
So here she's using sort of it's the double argument. The Republicans and Christians part at the end is something important to note. And I think I find getting students to sort of talk about what kind of argument she's making. On the one hand, she's making an argument that we live in a republic where despotism is a bad thing. We like democracy. We like our representative government. And anytime you submit blindly to a human power, including the slave power, you are, in a sense, being unrepublican. So she's making a patriotic argument and combining that with a religious argument, which is that if you believe that a law is sinful and you still follow that law, you're committing a sin. So she's, again, sort of using a whole arsenal of weapons here to advocate for civil disobedience. As far as I can tell, this is not unlike what David Walker is doing in a more forceful way, but saying, if you're really Christian and you really think this is sinful, you have the obligation to break this law. So she's polite about it, but it's interesting to get students to think about sort of the implications of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it also echoes, it foreshadows Thoreau too, and
yes,
also his piece about John Brown.
It does, yes, yes. I highlight this because I love the phrase she uses here. You must take it up, if you're going to attack slavery, you must take it up on Christian ground and fight against it with Christian weapons. And that's precisely what she is trying to do throughout her piece. So it's a good thing, again, to get students to think about what she means by that. Well, what is Christian ground? What does she think it is? And what are Christian weapons? What weapons do they have? Okay. Now, we've talked about women, we've talked about the media, we've talked about a host of other issues. What's another thing that you do to bring slavery home to Americans? Well, you bring it right into churches, stores, and homes. You make it accessible. You remind people at every point of the issue. And here is, I think, a great material object, which is fun to get students to take a look at. This is a contribution box, not unlike the little UNICEF boxes that kids take around on Halloween these days, in which they would gather pennies or other coins to support the Anti-Slavery Society. A picture on the box reminding you of the plight of the poor slave down on his knees in prayer, with a biblical passage below him, just, again, reminding you of the religious obligation to help this slave. These are passed around. I mean, it'd be interesting to know. I don't know too much about who used these and how they got passed around, but they were certainly available in churches and stores. I don't know if I guess there were no Halloween events where kids could take them around at this point. But anyway, it's a really important piece of this is sort of getting the message out materially.
Well, Shauna raises a good point in the chat.
Yeah.
She says, I think that students often miss the connection between the reform movement at large during this time and abolition as being very separate. The abolition is part and parcel of the larger evangelical reform movement, right?
Yes, absolutely. And that's what I talked about that, and maybe I went over it a little too quickly, but when I was talking about the revivalism and the connection that someone like Charles Finney makes between salvation, being saved, and wanting to go out and reform the world. That was his main point. Slavery is a piece of that, but there were also at the same time the missionary movement is getting started. There are tract societies sending people out to distribute religious periodicals and other materials, Bible societies, the Temperance Society. Remember, Theodore Dwight Weld himself was a temperance advocate as well as an anti-slavery advocate. These were all seen as part and parcel of what it meant to purify the nation and what it meant to sort of make this a Christian nation. If we can't do it by having a state church, we're going to have to do it ourselves. That was sort of the idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, finally, how to bring the issue of slavery home to Americans. You employ eloquent ex-slaves to speak of their personal experiences. Now, this is, again, the piece that probably, if you're familiar with abolition at all, you're familiar with Frederick Douglass. So I might not even say very much here because I know, Richard, you're going to call time in the not too distant future. But just know that, again, Frederick Douglass is part of this interracial movement himself. He is he meets up with William Lloyd Garrison and becomes sort of the poster child for what you can do, what an ex-slave can do himself. He emphasizes in his autobiographies that he puts out, he emphasizes the fact that he himself is self-educated, born into slavery, escapes to the North, and spends the rest of his life, or at least up until the time of the war, stumping around for the abolitionist movement. I have a couple excerpts here. This one is Garrison describing him. In the preface to the first edition of his narrative, Garrison writes a piece, and it's really interesting because both because of the way it talks about how he electrifies his audience by standing up, by being an ex-slave there on their own soil who can talk about his experiences, but also how he's being held up as the, again, sort of the poster child for the movement, saying, this is what slaves can become. Don't for a minute think that they are lesser human beings, because you have a man here like Frederick Douglass, who is one of the most eloquent orators of his day. And this, one of the things Douglass is best at, I just wanted to point this out to you, one of the things he's best at is pointing out the hypocrisy of American Christians. So over and over again in his speeches, he juxtaposes these slave owners who on the one hand are holding their Bible or quoting scripture or praying and torturing and hurting these poor slaves. So he brings, by putting these two things right together, he brings home the sense that this is not Christian. This is not Christian. He talks in other places about the difference between the American church and the real Christian church. That these are, again, pointing at the hypocrisy of this violent slave system. And in this last piece is actually a piece where he's talking to, when he says the Free Church up here, he's talking about the Free Church of Scotland, which is it's called the Free Church not because of any relation to slavery, but because of its relationship to the church in England more broadly. But when he goes to talk about slavery in this church, he uses this play on words, the sense that, well, you say you're a free church, but in fact, unless you stop supporting the slave system in the United States, you are not a free church. So he's always, both playfully, ironically, it's a great way to get students to think about rhetorically the types of arguments that folks are making here. And the last thing that I just wanted to mention is that this is the question that I really love to sort of press with students, because this is the question that abolitionists are faced with in this period. If you come to see slavery as a sin, is violence against it ever justified? And two sort of great examples of this are Nat Turner's Slave Revolt, which is documented in his Confession, the Confessions of Nat Turner, a great teaching document too, where he describes this horrific massacre of whites because of his sort of belief that slavery is sinful. And John Brown, who is a white Christian who is called to arms through his Christian commitments. And again, it's just a wonderful sort of teaching moment to get them to think about sort of in a democratic society, is violence justified, and in what situations? So the ethical question. So I'll just leave you there with the sort of John Brown, who becomes a martyr for the abolitionist cause, and like Lincoln, very much a sort of the sense that these two are the fallen heroes of the movement, but Christian martyrs as well. So the religious valences of that are really an important piece. There's some questions. There was something.
Any questions? Okay, well, then I think we have come to the end here. The talk about Frederick Douglass reminded me that in Freedom Story, our Teacher Serve instructional guide on teaching African American literature and history, there is an excellent essay on how to read a slave narrative. It's a new essay just recently put up by Bill Andrews, who teaches, who's a colleague of Laurie's at UNC Chapel Hill. I urge you to take a look at that, and that will help illuminate Frederick Douglass's autobiography and also how to present it to your students. Well, let me ask once again, are there any final thoughts, questions, or comments before we wrap up this morning? Any final word? Okay, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I remind you, please submit your evaluations. Laura has a question. Let me go to Laura, pass the microphone to her. Laura, it's all yours.
I'm kind of asking this for a discussion that a teacher had asked me about yesterday from the reading, and that was about using John Brown and the comparison of the question of, is he a terrorist or a hero? Do you have any, do you approach anything like that? Does it come up? Because the teacher was kind of wondering about looking at something like our current terrorism situation in comparison to the John Brown analogy, as
Uh-huh.
an analogy to John Brown. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a tricky one in some ways. I think it is. I like the idea of getting students to think about this as a current issue. What if? I mean, the problem with relating it to sort of terrorism, the way we've talked about terrorism in our country, is that they tend not. The students won't know very much about whether that's justified, or how you might justify that, even if you could justify it. So it's. But I think getting them to think about contemporary analogies to this is important. Like, what if someone passed a law in this country that outlawed, I don't know what, I mean, if you think of some example. I mean, I guess probably, what some scholars have said is the closest example, and then this is, again, could get pretty incendiary. I don't know if you all feel comfortable talking about this in classes, but it's the abortion issue. This is, some people have said this is the closest thing to the arguments made for and against slavery, is that now, all of a sudden you have sort of people thinking about a fetus as a human being, just as people, quite suddenly came to see blacks as human beings. And then what do you do if you're faced with, the idea of human beings, being violence being done against them? What do you do about that? But that's kind of a tricky thing to talk about in school, I realize. So a more general approach to what are the arguments for and against John Brown's, raid is maybe a less fraught way of talking about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Shauna suggests that a good approach might be to look at someone like Brown and the way he can raise awareness, but also make people in the middle reconsider their support.
Yeah.
Right. And then some of the comments here about would use, I guess, the abortion analogy would use at the college level. Yeah, that is a very difficult topic, and that's come up before in our seminars. Perhaps we'll focus on that. How do you teach John Brown? I know there was a big conference on that one last winter, and I gather that conference didn't resolve the issue very well either.
No, it's a tough question, and that's okay. We have, it's good to have tough questions that we have to wrestle with. But it's, and Nat Turner has always raised the same kind of issue for my students. I mean, on the one hand, they say, he was enslaved. He himself was being held against his will. On the other hand, does that justify killing 80 people, including babies? He was slaughtering babies. Yeah. So it's really, but it's important to think through some of those questions out loud.
Yeah, it is. Well, perhaps we'll do a seminar on that. That seems like a topic that would engage a lot of people and be quite useful in the classroom. Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me ask once again, any final thoughts, questions, or comments before we wrap up? Okay, I guess not. Well, thank you very much for your attention and participation. And I want to thank Laurie for leading an excellent seminar. This is the last seminar in the Florida Virtual School Series for this year. We'll be back next year with another round of programs. In the meantime, if you would like to sign up for our fall seminars that are for teachers all across the nation, please, the registration is open. I showed you that site before. Please go there. We'd love to have you join us. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today, and we will see you again next fall, I guess. Laura Wakefield will give you the date, and I look forward to reconnecting with you at that time. Take care now. Have a good summer.